The attic of the Thornwood estate had not been opened in at least a decade. Aggie could tell from the quality of the dust, not the thin layer that accumulated in rooms that were occasionally passed through, but the settled, undisturbed dust of a space that had been left alone long enough to develop its own particular stillness, the kind of stillness that had intentions. She had come up at 9 a.m. with a flashlight and the combination Harrison had given her years ago, not explaining why just saying the day I'm gone, go to the attic, after the east wall. You'll know what to do with what you find. She had not asked him to explain. After 15 years of marriage to Harrison Thornwood III, she had learned when a silence needed to be kept and when it needed to be broken. She had understood from the quality of his voice when he said it that this was a silence he had been keeping for a very long time and that it was costing him something. She had kept it too, until now. The safe was behind a tapestry. She had to move 3 trunks to reach an embroidered piece, heavy, the kind of thing that had been made to last and had lasted hanging over a section of wall that looked identical to every other section of wall, until you got close and noticed the slight irregularity of the paneling, the seam that was not quite flush. She moved the panel. The safe was small. Fireproof steel, the combination lock worn smooth from use that had happened before it was hidden here and not since. She turned the dial to Harrison's birthday, then hers, then the year they married, the sequence he had told her. She heard the mechanism release. She opened it. She had expected documents. She had not expected this document. The birth certificate was on top. Rosemary Owens, September 12, 1961. Father Harrison Thornwood II, Mother Marigold Owens, occupation of mother domestic servant. She read it twice. Below it a diary. Brown leather worn at the corners, the handwriting inside small and careful and frightened in the way of writing, produced by someone who was writing in secret and knew the secret was dangerous. She read the first page. I am writing this because I am afraid of what they will do if they find out I have kept anything. If someone reads this after I am gone, please find Rosemary. She is the true heir of the Thornwood family. She does not know. She must never be allowed to not know. Below the diary, a document, formal letterhead. The title in the clean typeface of legal language that had been chosen to make its subject matter sound routine. Agreement of perpetual confidentiality. She read the final clause. Mrs. Owens agrees that the child shall never bear the Thornwood name and shall never be informed of the identity of her father. In exchange, Mrs. Owens will receive $500 monthly contingent on her permanent absence from Thornwood property and her complete silence regarding the events of 1960 and 1961. 2 signatures at the bottom. Harrison Thornwood II and the family's attorney, dated 1961. Aggie sat in the attic with the birth certificate in her hands and the diary in her lap and the agreement on the floor beside her, and she thought about a woman named Marigold Owens who had written in a frightened hand about a child she had been paid to give up. She thought about Harrison III, who had known, who had kept this safe for 15 years, who had not been able to make himself open it. She thought about what he had said to her in those last hours. Do what I couldn't. She put the birth certificate in her pocket. She stood up. Her knees complained. Her back did not. The name she never knew. Harrison Thornwood III died on a Wednesday in November. The funeral was the kind of funeral that families like the Thornwoods produced the flowers arranged by a florist who had been doing Thornwood events for 20 years. The guest list managed by Lillian's assistant, the reception at the house afterward, with the catered food and the specific gravity of people who had come because it was expected and who moved through the rooms with the practiced ease of people who knew how to perform grief in formal settings. Aggie had stood beside the casket for 2 hours. She had shaken the hands and received the condolences and said the things that were said, and she had done it with the specific contained composure of a woman who had been composing herself in Thornwood spaces for 15 years and had gotten very good at it. The family, Lillian and Edward and their respective spouses and children, had moved around her with the specific choreography of people managing an inconvenience, which was what she had always been in their accounting and what she remained now. The last guest had left at 7. Harrison had been in the ground since 3. She had known when she married him what she was marrying into. She had been 58. He had been 64 and recently widowed, and had come to her school, the elementary school on Birch Street, where she had taught 3rd grade for 27 years, to speak to the students about local history, which was a project of his foundation's charitable program. She had organized the visit. She had met him in the hallway afterward. They had talked for 40 minutes. He had called her the following week. She had known from the beginning that the Thornwood family was a specific kind of family, the kind that had been wealthy long enough to have developed a mythology about itself, to have confused its own history with virtue, to have mistaken the accumulation of money over generations for evidence of inherent worth. She had known that in their accounting she was not equivalent. Her father had been a plumber. She had grown up in a house where money was managed carefully because there was not much of it. She had a teacher's salary and a teacher's pension and a teacher's sensibility, which was the sensibility of someone who had spent their professional life explaining things to children and had lost the habit of pretending that complicated things were simple. Harrison had loved her for that. His children had never forgiven him for it. Lillian had begun 2 days after the funeral. Not aggressively, that was not Lillian's way. Lillian operated with the cold precision of a person who had never needed to be aggressive because she had always had structural advantages and knew how to use them. She had come to Aggie's sitting room. Aggie's sitting room, the small one at the back of the east wing that Harrison had made specifically for her, because he had understood that she needed a space in this house that was hers, and she had sat down with the specific posture of a woman conducting a business meeting. She had said, "Agatha, we need to talk about the transition." Aggie had said, "All right." Lillian had said, "Father's estate is straightforward. The will is clear. Edward and I are the primary beneficiaries. You're provided for, there's a stipend, and of course we want to make sure you're comfortable. But the house is part of the estate, and we'll need to discuss a timeline for your relocation." She had said relocation the way you said a logistical matter, something to be managed, something with moving parts that needed to be arranged. Aggie had said, "I see." Lillian had said, "We're not rushing you. You'll have time to find something appropriate. And of course the stipend will help with that." She had said appropriate with the specific inflection that communicated what appropriate meant in her vocabulary, which was something suited to a woman of your background, which is not this. Aggie had said, "Thank you, Lillian." She had not said anything else. Lillian had seemed mildly surprised by this, had seemed to expect either gratitude or resistance, and had received neither. She had left. Aggie had stood in her sitting room after Lillian left, and she had looked at the room, at the chair she had read in for 15 years, at the shelves, with the books she had brought from her previous apartment, at the small desk where she had written letters and graded papers in the years when she still occasionally tutored, and she had thought, well, she had thought Harrison. She had thought about his voice in the last week when speaking had become an effort, and he had been choosing his words with the specific economy of someone who understood that the supply was limited. He had said, "Aggie." She had said, "I'm here." He had said, "On the attic, east wall, behind the tapestry. Combination, our date." She had said, "Harrison, what?" He had said, "I kept it too long. I was a coward about it. Do what I couldn't." He had gone to sleep. He had not been fully lucid again. She had not gone to the attic immediately. There had been the funeral and the reception and the 2 weeks of Lillian and Edward moving through the house with their clipboards and their assessors, and she had been present for all of it, quiet and contained the way she had been present in this family for 15 years. But she had been thinking about the attic. She had been thinking about do what I couldn't and what that meant from a man who had spent his life inside the Thornwood mythology, who had been a Thornwood in the way of someone for whom that identity was so foundational that questioning it would have required dismantling himself. He had known something. He had kept it for 15 years. He had not been able to make himself do anything about it. He had given it to her. She was standing in the hallway outside the sitting room when she heard Lillian's voice from the parlor where Lillian and Edward had established themselves as the operational center of the estate transition, the parlor where Aggie had sat at Christmas dinners for 15 years and been received with the courteous distance of a family managing an awkward guest. She heard Lillian say, "She won't make trouble. She's not that type." She heard Edward say, "You're sure?" She heard Lillian say, "She's a retired school teacher, Edward." What is she going to do? Aggie stood in the hallway. She was 73 years old and her knees hurt in the cold, and she had been a third-grade teacher for 27 years, which meant she had spent her professional life being underestimated by adults who did not understand that the ability to explain long division to 8-year-olds required a specific quality of patience and precision that most people never developed. She turned away from the parlor. She went to the stairs. Not the main staircase, the narrow one at the back of the east wing, the servants' stairs, that no one used anymore but that she had used occasionally because they were closer to her sitting room, and she had always preferred the direct route. She went up, past the second floor, past the third, to the door at the top that led to the attic. She was not sure what she was going to find. She was sure that Harrison had needed her to find it. She opened the door. The attic was cold. Not the cold of a room that had been cooled by weather, the specific cold of a space that had been sealed from the heat of the house below for long enough that it had developed its own temperature, independent of the seasons, the cold of abandonment rather than winter. Aggie stood at the top of the attic stairs and let her eyes adjust. The space was large, the full footprint of the house's top floor, with the ceiling following the pitch of the roof on both sides, the center high enough to stand and the edges requiring a stoop. The dormer windows were coated with the grime of years, and the light that came through them was thin and gray and sufficient. She could see. What she could see was the accumulated evidence of a family that had been wealthy, long enough to have a great deal. It no longer needed furniture under sheets, trunks stacked against the south wall boxes and crates, and the various detritus of generations of acquisition. The dust was thick, and even the dust of a place that had not been disturbed. She walked toward the east wall. The tapestry was not immediately obvious. It hung between two roof support beams, the same color as the shadows around it, the embroidered pattern obscured by dust and time. She almost passed it. Then she noticed the way it hung, not flush against the wall, the way a decorative tapestry would hang, but with a slight gap, the way something hung to conceal rather than adorn. She moved it aside. Behind it, a section of wall paneling that did not quite match the paneling on either side. Same material, same paint, but newer or differently aged, the specific slight difference of something installed at a different time. She found the seam with her fingers. It took her several minutes to work it loose. It had been fitted carefully, and the years had settled it. But eventually the panel came free, and behind it was the hawked alcove Harrison had described, and inside the alcove was the safe, small, perhaps 12 inches square. The combination lock was the old-fashioned kind, a dial with numbers around the circumference, the mechanism requiring a specific sequence of left and right turns. The metal was cold under her hands. She turned the dial. Their wedding anniversary. The date Harrison had given her years ago without explaining why, just saying, "Remember this sequence." She had remembered. She had not known what for. The mechanism clicked. She opened it. She had expected documents. She had not expected the weight of what documents could contain. The birth certificate was on top, as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if whoever had last held these papers had understood that this was the thing that needed to be seen first. She read it slowly. Rosemary Owens, born September 12, 1961, weight 6 pounds 4 ounces. The hospital name, she noted it, a hospital that no longer existed, the kind of institutional fact that placed a document in a specific time and place. Father Harrison Thornwood II, Mother Marigold Owens, occupation domestic servant. She set it down on the attic floor beside her and picked up the diary. The leather cover was brown and worn at the corners in the way of books that had been handled a great deal. The clasp had been closed but not locked. She opened it. The handwriting was small, not cramped, careful, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship and was applying it to a task that required precision, who understood that these words needed to be legible to someone she would never meet. She read the first page. Then the second. Then she sat down on the attic floor. Her knees complained about the cold boards, and she noted this and ignored it, and she read. Marigold Owens had come to work for the Thornwood household in 1959 at the age of 22. She had come from a town 3 hours south, recommended by a cousin who had worked in the kitchen the previous year. She had been hired as a housemaid. She had written, I want to say, I didn't know what I was doing. But I knew. I was young, and he was kind to me in a way no one in that house was kind to anyone who worked there, and I confused kindness for something else. That's the truth of it. She had written about the year that followed, about the specific reality of her situation, which was the reality of a young woman without resources in a household with complete power over her circumstances, about the negotiation that had happened after she became pregnant, which had not been a negotiation in any real sense, because the terms had been set by the side with all the resources, and she had had none. About signing the agreement, she had written, they had a lawyer there, not for me for them. The lawyer explained the terms, and Mr. Thornwood sat in his chair and didn't look at me while the lawyer explained, and when the lawyer finished, Mr. Thornwood said, "Is that acceptable?" And I thought about what would happen if I said no. And I said yes. She had written about leaving, about the $500 a month which had arrived reliably for years, and then after Harrison II died, had continued arriving from the estate continuing to honor a commitment that the estate had probably never examined closely. She had written about Rosemary, about giving birth in a hospital in another county and coming home without the child and telling her landlady she had been sick. About the years that followed the work, she had found the life she had built, from what remained after that year, the specific labor of constructing a self from the material left over after a significant portion of it has been taken. She had written, I called her Rosemary in my heart for the rest of my life. I don't know what they called her. I don't know if they let her keep that name. I only know that she exists, that she is Harrison Thornwood's daughter, and that she was taken from me and given to a world that was told she didn't exist. The final pages were different from the rest, written more recently, the handwriting less steady, the hand of a woman in her 80s whose body had begun to fail. She had written, I am sending this diary to Harrison III. I have his address. I know he is not his father. I have watched him from a distance over the years, the way you watch the family of someone who has wronged you, and I believe he is a better man. I hope he will do what his father should have done. I hope he will find Rosemary and tell her the truth. I hope he will make it right. And then at the bottom of the last page, in the uneven hand of someone writing with what was left, I have hoped for 40 years. I am tired of hoping, but I am sending the diary anyway because it is all I have left to do. The rest is up to whoever finds it. Marigold Owens had died 8 years ago. Harrison had received this diary and put it in a safe and locked it behind a false wall and carried the weight of it for however many years remained to him after that, and he had not been able to make himself do what she had hoped he would do. Aggie sat on the cold attic floor with the diary in her lap. She thought about Harrison in the last weeks, the specific quality of a man who was dying with something unfinished, the particular restlessness that she had attributed to illness and now understood was guilt. She thought about do what I couldn't, and she understood now what he had meant by it and why he had not been able to do it himself. He had been a Thornwood. The Thornwood name had been the structure of his identity for 64 years. Dismantling it would have required dismantling himself. She was not a Thornwood. She was the daughter of a plumber from Millbrook Road, and she had spent 15 years in this house watching a family confuse money for worth, and she had no mythology to protect. She thought about a woman named Rosemary Owens who was 65 years old and had been told her whole life that she did not have a father or that her father was unknown or whatever story had been constructed to fill the space where the truth should have been. She thought about a woman named Marigold who had written, I am tired of hoping, and had sent the diary anyway. She closed the diary. She held it for a moment. She said quietly to the cold air of the attic, to the dust and the gray light and the weight of what she was holding, You've waited long enough, Marigold. She gathered the documents. She stood up. Her knees were cold and stiff, and she stood up anyway with the specific, determined movement of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to let her joints negotiate her out of it. She carried the safe's contents down the attic stairs. She had work to do. She began with what she knew. The birth certificate gave her a date, September 12, 1961, and a name and a hospital that no longer existed. The agreement gave her a payment structure, which meant there were financial records, somewhere disbursements from the Thornwood estate accounts over decades. The diary gave her the human shape of the story, which was the kind of evidence that did not appear in official records, and was therefore the most important kind. She sat at the small desk in her sitting room, the room Lillian had not yet repossessed the room Harrison had made for her, and she laid everything out in the order she would work through it. She was a teacher. She had spent 27 years helping children understand complicated things by breaking them into components and working through each one in sequence. The skill applied here. What did she have? What did she need? What was the order of operations? She had documents. She needed to verify them against public records. She needed to find Rosemary Owens, who would be 65 years old if she was alive. She started with public records. The county courthouse was 20 minutes from the Thornwood estate. She had been there once before for the recording of the deed when she and Harrison had made certain adjustments to property titles in their first years of marriage. She remembered the clerk's office institutional fluorescence, the smell of old paper, the specific patience of government employees managing the documentary record of a county's entire history. She went on a Tuesday when Lillian and Edward were occupied with the estate attorney. She told no one where she was going. She had learned in 15 years of being underestimated that the most useful thing about being underestimated was the freedom it created. Lillian thought she was a retired school teacher with no resources and no knowledge of how the world worked outside a classroom. Lillian was not entirely wrong about the school teacher part. She was entirely wrong about the rest. The birth records confirmed what the certificate said. The hospital had closed in 1978, but the county had the transferred records. A clerk, a young woman who was professionally helpful without being curious, which was the ideal combination for this purpose, found the record for September 12, 1961, and confirmed the information on the certificate. The record existed. It was authentic. Rosemary Owens had been born on that date in that hospital to those parents. The father's name was on the official record, Harrison Thornwood II. Whatever had been done afterward, whatever arrangements had been made, whatever story had been constructed, the original record had never been altered. The truth was, in the county archives, exactly where Marigold had put it by insisting on the real father's name, which had been Aggie, thought the one act of resistance available to her. She had put his name in ink. 40 years of silence had not erased it. She found the payment records through a different route. The estate attorney, not the current one who worked for Lillian and Edward, but the previous one who had retired and whose records had passed to an archival service, had maintained files that were technically accessible to surviving spouses. She was a surviving spouse. She had Harrison's authorization in the sense that Harrison had given her the combination to the safe and told her to do what he hadn't. She hired a document retrieval service. The payments had continued for 43 years from 1961 until Marigold's death in 2015. Monthly disbursements described in the estate records as a charitable annuity to M. Owens. The amount had never changed, $500 per month, the same as the agreement specified, not adjusted for inflation, not reconsidered. The Thornwood estate had been paying $500 a month for 43 years as the price of a woman's silence, and no one had ever examined the line item closely enough to ask what it was for. Aggie did the arithmetic. 43 years, 12 months, $500, $258,000. For the destruction of a woman's life and the erasure of a child's identity. She found Rosemary through the state nursing license registry. A license for Rosemary Marie Owens, first issued in 1982, renewed continuously since then. Current employer, Hillside Care Center, licensed skilled nursing facility. Current status active. She was alive. She was still working. 65 years old and still working in a nursing home. Aggie sat with this for a long time. She thought about Rosemary Owens at 65, the age of retirement, the age at which most people were beginning to arrange the final chapter of their lives, assessing what they had accumulated, making decisions about what came next. She thought about what Rosemary had accumulated: a nursing license, 35 years of caring for elderly patients, a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. A life built entirely on her own labor, with no inheritance, no family name, no knowledge that she was owed anything. She thought about the Thornwood estate. She thought about Lillian's charitable foundation and Edward's corporate offices, and the house she was sitting in, which had been built and maintained and expanded over decades on the foundation of a family fortune that had been at least in part constructed on what should have belonged to Rosemary. Not entirely. The Thornwoods had built real things, done real work, made real investments. But the foundation, the original capital, the initial advantage had been accumulated partly at the expense of a woman who had been paid to disappear, and a child who had been told she didn't exist. She thought about Harrison. She thought about what it must have been like to receive Marigold's diary, to open an envelope one day and find 200 pages of the truth about his father, about his family, about the inheritance that had made his life possible. To understand what that meant, to understand who Rosemary was and what she was owed and what he had been living on. And to put it in a safe. She did not judge him for it. She had been a teacher long enough to understand that understanding what you should do and being able to do it were different skills, that most people's moral failures were failures of courage rather than comprehension. He had known. He had not been able to act, but he had not destroyed the evidence. He had kept it, and he had given it to her. She picked up the phone. She called the number listed for Hillside Care Center. A receptionist answered. Aggie said, "I'm calling to speak with one of your nurses, Rosemary Owens." The receptionist said, "May I ask what this is regarding?" Aggie considered the question. She thought about how you explained this. How you said your father was a man who built his fortune partly on your erasure, and I have proof, and I am a woman you have never met, and I want to give you something that was taken from you before you were old enough to know it existed. She said it's a personal matter, a family matter. I have some information that I believe concerns her directly, and I would very much appreciate the opportunity to share it with her. She said, "Tell her my name is Agatha Pembroke. Tell her I was married to Harrison Thornwood III. Tell her I think she deserves to hear something that should have been said to her a long time ago." The line was quiet for a moment. The receptionist said, "I'll pass that message along." Aggie set the phone down. She looked at the documents on her desk, the birth certificate with Harrison II's name in ink, the diary Marigold had written in frightened, careful handwriting, the agreement with its 2 signatures at the bottom. Somewhere across the city in a nursing home on the other side of the class divide that had defined everything about both their lives, a woman named Rosemary Owens was going about the work of caring for people who could not care for themselves. She did not yet know her name was wrong. She was about to find out. Hillside Care Center was on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that had been working class for as long as the city had existed, and had remained so with the specific persistence of places that didn't have the kind of assets that attracted the attention of developers. The building was clean and adequately maintained, and had the look of an institution that was doing the best it could with what it had, which was the look of most institutions that serve people who didn't have other options. Aggie arrived at 10 in the morning. She had not called ahead beyond the initial call, had not announced her visit, had not asked for a meeting. She had learned in 27 years of teaching that some conversations needed to be approached obliquely, that arriving with the full weight of what you were carrying sometimes prevented the conversation from happening at all. Children needed to trust you before they could hear difficult things. She suspected the same was true of adults who had spent 65 years being told nothing. She told the receptionist she was there to visit a resident, an elderly woman she had heard lived here. She gave a name, a woman she had identified in the records as a long-term patient. This was true. She was going to visit that woman. She was also going to observe Rosemary Owens. She was a teacher. She knew how to be in a room without being the center of it. She found a chair in the common room. She watched. Rosemary was not hard to identify. She was 65 and moved with the specific efficiency of someone who had been doing physical work for a long time and had learned to conserve energy without appearing to the walk of a person who knew where everything was and didn't waste motion. Her hair was gray-white pulled back. Her hands, when she handed a patient a medication cup, showed the specific quality of hands that had been used for decades, not delicate, not rough, but functional in the way of tools that had been well maintained because they were necessary. She spoke to the patients the way Aggie had spoken to her students, simply directly with the specific patience of someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect. She didn't talk down to the elderly man who asked her the same question 3 times. In 10 minutes, she answered the same question 3 times in 10 minutes with the same tone, the same information, the same small nod that communicated, "This is not a problem. This is what I am here for." Aggie watched her for 3 hours. She watched her hold the hand of a woman who was frightened. She watched her explain a medication change to a man who was confused and needed to hear it twice and then again. She watched her fix a lunch tray that had been assembled wrong and deliver it with no commentary on the fact that it had been assembled wrong, just the correct tray, handed over with a, "There you go, Mr. Patterson." She thought this woman has been caring for people her whole life. She thought she doesn't know anyone was supposed to care for her. At 2:00, Rosemary took her break. She went to the small cafe across the street, a narrow room with 4 tables and a counter, and the specific utilitarian atmosphere of a place that existed to provide coffee to people who needed it quickly and didn't require anything else from the transaction. She ordered black coffee and sat at the table by the window. Aggie followed her in. She ordered her own coffee. She sat down across from Rosemary. Rosemary looked at her. She said, "You were in the common room this morning." Aggie said, "Yes." Rosemary said, "You weren't visiting Mrs. Calabresi." Aggie said, "No, I was watching you." A silence. Rosemary said, "You're the woman who called Agatha Pembroke." Aggie said, "Yes." Rosemary's hands were around her coffee cup. She had the specific stillness of someone who was waiting for something to land and was bracing for the impact. She said, "What do you want?" Aggie reached into her bag. She placed the birth certificate on the table between them. She did not say anything. She watched Rosemary look at it. The reading took less time than she expected and longer than she could measure. Less time, because the document was simple, the information was clear, the names were legible, the date was unambiguous. Rosemary's eyes moved down the page in the efficient way of someone who processed written information quickly, longer than she could measure because of what happened in Rosemary's face while she read. It was not a dramatic change. She was not a woman who did dramatic. It was the specific internal rearrangement that happened when information arrived that required the complete recalibration of something you had believed your entire life. The face stayed composed. What moved was something behind it. Rosemary looked at the line that said "Father." She looked at it for a long time. She set the certificate down. She said, "Where did you get this?" Aggie said, "From a safe in the attic of the Thornwood estate. My husband left it there. He received it from your mother 8 years ago before she died." Rosemary was very still. She said, "My mother sent this to Harrison Thornwood." Aggie said the third yes. She sent him the certificate and a diary she had kept. She hoped he would do something with it. He kept it in the safe. She said he told me about it when he was dying. He asked me to do what he hadn't. Rosemary looked at the certificate again. She looked at the name of her father. She said, "I asked my mother once, when I was about 12. I asked her who my father was. She said he was a man who couldn't be part of our lives. She said he had other obligations. She said I asked if he knew about me. She said he knows you exist." She picked up the certificate. She held it. She said that's what she said. "He knows you exist." She set it back on the table. She pushed it toward Aggie. She said, "I've lived 65 years without them. I raised myself. I put myself through nursing school. I've been caring for people for 35 years and I've built a life out of what I had." She said, "I don't need the Thornwoods. I've never needed them." Aggie said, "I know." She did not reach for the certificate. She said, But I need to tell you something, Rosemary, and I need you to hear it. She said the Thornwood family fortune, the estate, the industries, the foundation Lillian runs, was built on a foundation that includes what was taken from you. Not all of it, but part of the original capital came from decisions that your father made that were designed to cut you out. She said you have a legal claim. You have a birth certificate, a diary, and a signed agreement that constitutes evidence of fraudulent concealment of inheritance. The estate, as it currently stands, can be challenged on those grounds. She said, I'm not asking you to fight for the money. I'm asking you to fight for the truth. Because Marigold spent 40 years hoping someone would tell it, and Harrison spent 15 years not being able to, and I am 73 years old, and the daughter of a plumber, and I have nothing to lose. She said, I will stand beside you through all of it. She said, but I can't do it without you. Rosemary looked at her. She said, you're serious. Aggie said, I taught third grade for 27 years. I am always serious. A sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, not yet, but something in that direction. Rosemary looked at the birth certificate. She looked at the name of her father. She said, why are you doing this? You could take the stipend Lillian offered and live quietly. Why does this matter to you? Aggie said. Because they did the same thing to me that they did to you. Different scale, different form. But the logic was the same. You are not one of us. Therefore, you don't count. Therefore, we can treat you however we want. She said, I got tired of it. She said your mother got tired of it too, but she was alone and afraid, and she made the only choice that seemed available to her. She said, you're not alone, and I'm not afraid. She said, I'm a retired school teacher whose knees hurt and who has very little left to lose. That makes me, as it turns out, a fairly dangerous person. Rosemary looked at her for a long moment. She said, I need to think. Aggie said, of course. She reached across the table. She placed the birth certificate back in front of Rosemary. She said, take this with you. Read the diary tonight. I have a copy for you. And call me when you're ready. She said Marigold wrote for 40 years so that someone would find you and tell you the truth. That's done now. The next part is yours to decide. She stood. She picked up her coffee cup. She said, she called you Rosemary in her heart her whole life. She wrote that. She said, whatever you decide, you should know that. Rosemary called on a Thursday. She said, I read the diary. She said all of it. She said, tell me who the lawyer is. Malcolm Cross had his office on the third floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous century and still carried the weight of that original purpose. The high ceilings, the marble floors in the lobby, the specific gravity of a space that had been built to communicate institutional permanence. Malcolm's office was not like the lobby. It had the look of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and had stopped caring about what his office communicated to anyone. Books everywhere, not arranged accumulated, briefs and folders and the specific archaeological layers of a professional life that had been lived in this room for a long time, a desk that held 3 times what a desk should reasonably hold. Malcolm Cross himself was 58, with the specific compact energy of a man who had been angry about something for a long time and had learned to make the anger productive. He had been the Thornwood family's estate attorney for 12 years. He had been dismissed 10 years ago, which he had described to Aggie on the phone as the best professional development of my career. He had been waiting, she suspected, for something like this. He read for 40 minutes. He did not speak while he read. He turned pages with the methodical attention of a man who read legal documents the way other people read thrillers for the plot, yes, but also for the specific technical details that told him whether the plot was going to hold. At the end of 40 minutes, he set the documents down. He said, where did you find this? Aggie said, safe in the attic. My husband left it there. He said Harrison knew. Aggie said, for 15 years. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. He said, the birth certificate is authenticated by the county record, which I can verify. The diary is corroborating testimony not legally dispositive on its own, but powerful evidentiary support. The agreement. He picked up the agreement. He read it again more slowly. He said, the agreement is extraordinary. It's not just morally reprehensible. It's legally defective in multiple ways. The consideration $500 a month is wildly disproportionate to what's being exchanged, which is a minor's inheritance rights. You cannot contract away a child's inheritance through an agreement with the mother. The child is not a party to the contract. A minor cannot be bound by a contract they didn't sign. He set it down. He said, "Rosemary, you were never legally bound by this agreement. You never could have been. The agreement was between Harrison II and Marigold Owens. You were a newborn. Your rights were not hers to sign away." Rosemary said, "So I have a claim." Malcolm said, "You have a claim, but I need to tell you about the complications before we go further." He leaned back. He said the standard statute of limitations for civil inheritance claims in this state is 6 years from the date of discovery or majority, whichever is later. You're 65. The limitations period on a straightforward inheritance claim expired decades ago. Rosemary said, "So we can't do anything." Malcolm said, "I didn't say that." He picked up the agreement again. He said there's a doctrine called fraudulent concealment. When a defendant actively conceals the existence of a claim, not just fails to disclose, but takes affirmative steps to hide it, the statute of limitations is told, meaning it doesn't run during the period of concealment. The clock doesn't start until the plaintiff discovers the concealed information. He said the agreement itself is evidence of fraudulent concealment. It's a signed document in which Harrison II contracted with a lawyer to ensure that you would never know about your claim. The payment structure was designed to maintain the concealment $500 a month to keep Marigold quiet, and therefore to keep you ignorant of your rights. He said the concealment continued through Harrison III, who received the diary and the certificate 8 years ago and locked them in a safe rather than disclosing them to you. He said the fraudulent concealment doctrine applies. Your limitations period didn't start until Aggie opened that safe. He looked at Rosemary. He said, "You have a claim. The legal path is unconventional, but it exists." The room was quiet. Aggie watched Rosemary. She had been watching Rosemary for days now, had been learning the grammar of her expressions, which were not abundant, but were specific, the expressions of a woman who had learned economy in response to a life that had required her to be more than she got in return. She watched Rosemary absorb this information, the slow intake, the processing, the specific stillness before the response. Rosemary said, "What are the risks?" Malcolm said, "Significant. The Thornwood family has resources I cannot match. They have lawyers I cannot match. If we go to court, it will be expensive and long, and they will use every procedural mechanism available to them to delay and exhaust us." He said there is also the personal cost. They will challenge the diary's authenticity. They will challenge your mother's credibility. They will characterize her and possibly you in ways designed to undermine sympathy. He said, "I want to be clear about what this costs if we lose. I will lose my license or come close to it. I have enough history with this family that a failed attack on their estate will be used against me. Aggie, you will lose whatever relationship you have with the estate, and probably the stipend Lillian offered. And Rosemary," he looked at her directly, "he said they will do to you what they did to your mother. They will make you the problem. They will say your mother was lying, that the diary is fabricated, that you are motivated by greed. They will try to make you disappear again the way they made you disappear the first time." Rosemary was quiet. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "My mother was quiet for 40 years. She said she signed a paper and she took their money and she was quiet because she was 22 and alone and afraid. And they had all the power. She said she died in a nursing home that was worse than the one where I work. She died without anyone knowing who she was, without anyone knowing what had been done to her." She said. And she wrote 200 pages about it because she couldn't stand the thought that it would just disappear, that no one would ever know. She looked at Malcolm. She said, "I'm not 22, I'm not alone, and I'm not afraid of them." She said, "My mother was quiet for 40 years. I'm not going to be quiet for 40 minutes. Malcolm looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Aggie. He said there's a way to do this that doesn't require going to court. At least not initially. He said the silence agreement, contains a clause that was standard in these documents in the 1960s. It requires that if the agreement is ever disclosed, the disclosing party must first offer the other party an opportunity to remedy the breach privately. He said, in other words, we have to tell them before we can use it publicly. We have to give them a chance to respond. He said most lawyers use this to delay, but in this case, it can be used differently. We can request a private meeting, present the evidence, and offer them a choice, acknowledge Rosemary's claim, and negotiate a settlement, or we take this to the county prosecutor's office. He said because the agreement isn't just a civil matter, it's evidence of criminal fraud. The concealment of an inheritance combined with the financial arrangement that maintained the concealment constitutes fraud in this jurisdiction. Criminal fraud has no statute of limitations when concealment is ongoing. He said, I'm not saying we necessarily want to criminally prosecute, but the threat of it, the real documented, substantiated threat of it, is a negotiating tool that their money cannot simply make go away. He looked at both of them. He said, I want to be honest. This is the better path, but it will be uncomfortable. We will be in a room with Lillian Thornwood Crane and Edward Thornwood, and we will put documents in front of them that destroy the story their family has told about itself for 60 years. And they will react. Rosemary said, let them react. Aggie said, yes. Malcolm said, all right. He reached for a legal pad. He said, then let's prepare. They worked for 3 hours. Malcolm organized the documents into the specific order of a legal argument. Each piece of evidence labeled each connection between pieces, annotated the whole assembled into something that could be presented clearly and withstood challenge. He explained each element to Rosemary, who followed with the focused attention of a woman absorbing new information in the way of someone who had spent 35 years learning medical protocols methodically without panic, with the understanding that the details mattered. Aggie watched the two of them work. She thought about Harrison in the attic, the safe, the combination, do what I couldn't. She thought about Marigold writing, I am tired of hoping, and sending the diary anyway. She thought this is what it looks like when the hoping finally works. When she left Malcolm's office at 7 in the evening, the three of them stood on the sidewalk in the November dark. Malcolm said, I'll draft the letter requesting the meeting. They have 7 days to respond. He said, if they don't respond, we go to the prosecutor. He said, whatever happens, I want you both to know I've been waiting 10 years for something like this. He went inside. Aggie and Rosemary stood on the sidewalk. Rosemary said, are you sure about this? Aggie said, my husband spent 15 years not being sure. Look where that got us. Rosemary said, fair point. Aggie said, also, I'm 73. My knees hurt, and Lillian Thornwood has been condescending to me for 15 years. I have excellent motivation. Rosemary made the sound again, the one that was almost a laugh. This time it was fully a laugh. It was, Aggie thought, probably one of the most important sounds she had ever heard. The letter went out on a Monday. Malcolm had written it with the specific economy of a lawyer who understood that the weight of a document was carried by its precision, not its length. It stated that Agatha Pembroke, surviving spouse of Harrison Thornwood III, requested a meeting with Lillian Thornwood Crane and Edward Thornwood IV to discuss matters pertaining to the estate. It stated that additional parties would be present. It stated that the matters to be discussed were of significant legal consequence to all parties. It did not say what the matters were. Lillian called Aggie the same day. She said, what is this about Agatha? If you're challenging the estate settlement, your husband's attorney. Aggie said, it's not about my settlement, Lillian. Please come on Thursday. Bring whoever you need to bring. She said, I've made dinner. She had not, in fact, made dinner. She had ordered it from the caterer that the Thornwood family used for estate events charged to the account that was still in Harrison's name, and that Lillian had not yet transferred because Lillian's organizational timeline had assumed Aggie would be gone before it mattered. She had set the dining room table with the good china, the Thornwood china, the set that came out for significant occasions, and she had arranged the chairs so that the head of the table, which Harrison had always occupied, was empty. She sat in the chair to the right of the head. Rosemary sat to her right. Malcolm sat across from them, his briefcase on the floor beside his chair, the folder closed on the table in front of him. They had arrived early. They waited. Lillian and Edward came at 7 with their attorney, a man Aggie did not know, younger than Malcolm, with the specific confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt his position. They walked through the door with the ease of people entering a room they considered theirs, which the dining room of the Thornwood estate was in their understanding, which was the understanding of people who had grown up in this room and eaten at this table, and absorbed the assumption of ownership the way children absorbed everything, without noticing because it was simply the atmosphere. They stopped. Lillian's eyes went first to Rosemary. It was not a dramatic stop. Lillian was not a person who made dramatic movements. It was the specific fractional halt of someone whose forward motion has been interrupted by the processing of unexpected information. She had expected Aggie and perhaps Malcolm. She had not expected a third person. She had not expected that third person's face. Aggie watched her look at Rosemary. She watched Lillian's brain doing the thing that brains did when they encountered a face that resembled a face they had known well, the automatic pattern, matching the comparison, the specific unsettled quality of recognition that could not be placed. Harrison II had been dead for decades, but his portrait hung in the library and his photograph was on the mantel in the study, and Lillian had grown up looking at that face. Rosemary's face was not identical. It was not supposed to be identical. It was similar enough. Edward had gone still beside his sister. Aggie said, "Please sit down. There's food if anyone wants it." No one moved toward the food. They sat. Lillian's lawyer opened his notepad. Lillian said, "Agatha, what is this?" Not a question. The specific flat delivery of a woman who was managing her response while she assessed the situation. Aggie said, "I'd like to make some introductions first." She said, "This is Malcolm Cross. I believe you know him." Lillian looked at Malcolm with the expression of someone encountering a person they had hoped not to see again. Aggie said, "And this is Rosemary Owens." She said she is 65 years old. She has lived in this city her entire life. She has been a registered nurse for 35 years and has spent that time caring for elderly patients in a facility on the east side. She said she is also the daughter of Harrison Thornwood II. The room received this in its own specific way. Lillian's face did not change. This was a skill Aggie had watched her deploy it for 15 years, the ability to receive unwanted information without visibly receiving it. The face stayed composed. The composure had a quality to it now, though that was different from its usual quality. It was the composure of effort rather than ease. Edward's face was less practiced. He looked at Rosemary and then at the table. Aggie opened the folder. She placed the birth certificate in the center of the table. She said Rosemary Owens, born September 12, 1961, Father Harrison Thornwood II, Mother Marigold Owens, domestic servant. The record is in the county archive. It has been there for 65 years. She placed the agreement beside it. She said, "This is the silence agreement." It was signed by Harrison Thornwood II and the family's attorney in 1961. It required Marigold Owens to accept $500 a month and never disclose the identity of Rosemary's father. It required that Rosemary never be told who her father was. It required that she never bear the Thornwood name. She let that sit for a moment. She said the agreement was honored. Marigold was quiet for 40 years. Rosemary was never told. The payments continued until Marigold's death 8 years ago. She placed the diary. She said, "This is Marigold Owens' diary." 200 pages. She wrote it over the course of her life and sent it to Harrison III 1 week before she died. She asked him to find Rosemary and tell her the truth. She looked at Lillian. She said Harrison kept it in a safe in the attic for 8 years. He was not able to make himself use it. When he was dying, he told me where it was and asked me to do what he hadn't. Lillian said, "This is..." She said it with the beginning of the word fabrication and then stopped. She stopped because she was looking at Rosemary. She was looking at Rosemary the way she had been looking at her since she walked in with the specific attention of someone trying to resolve a recognition that would not resolve cleanly, and something in what she saw had changed her calculation about what she was going to say. Aggie watched her look. She watched Lillian understand in whatever way Lillian understood things that she did not want to understand, that the face across the table was not a coincidence and not fabrication, and not something that could be managed by the application of sufficient confidence. She watched the composure do the thing that composure did when the effort required to maintain it exceeded the capacity available. It did not collapse. It tightened. Lillian said, "This is an attempt to extort this family using forged documents and a hired impersonator." Malcolm said, "The documents are authenticated. The birth certificate matches the county record. The diary's physical composition has been analyzed. The paper, the ink, the handwriting are consistent with the stated date of composition. The agreement signatures have been compared to known exemplars of Harrison II's signature from other documents in the estate record." He said, "We also have DNA." He set a document on the table. He said Rosemary provided a sample voluntarily. "We obtained a comparative sample through legal means from material in the county medical record. The analysis shows a 50% allele match consistent with a father-child relationship." He said Rosemary Owens is the biological daughter of Harrison Thornwood II. She is the half-sibling of the late Harrison Thornwood III. She is the half-aunt of both of you. He said under the laws of this state, a biological child who was fraudulently excluded from a parent's estate has standing to claim their rightful share. The fraudulent concealment doctrine tolls the statute of limitations for the duration of the concealment. He said Rosemary has a legal claim to 50% of the Thornwood estate. Edward said that's... He looked at his lawyer. His lawyer was reading the DNA report. His lawyer's expression was the expression of a man reading something he had not expected to read and was taking a moment to absorb. Lillian stood up. She said, "This is not over. You are not going to walk into this house, our house." And she said our house, and then she heard herself say it, and she looked at Rosemary, and she heard it again in a different way. She said, "Giles, call Harrison's estate attorney now." Her lawyer, Giles, was still reading the DNA report. He said, "Lillian, give me a moment." Lillian looked at Aggie. She said, "You have no idea what you've done." Aggie said, "I've done what my husband asked me to do. I've done what Marigold Owens hoped someone would do before she died in a nursing home without anyone knowing who she was." She said, "I've told the truth." She said, "I understand that's inconvenient." Malcolm said, "I want to be clear about the options. You can engage a state counsel and pursue this through probate court, in which case the DNA evidence and the fraud documentation become part of the public record. Alternatively, you can negotiate a private settlement with Rosemary's interests properly represented." He said I should mention that the silence agreement as a documented instrument of inheritance fraud is a matter I'm required to report to the county prosecutor's office. The civil and criminal questions are separate. Settling the civil claim does not resolve the criminal question. He said someone specifically, the lawyers who drafted and maintained the agreement over decades, will be answering to the prosecutor regardless of what you decide about the civil settlement. He said, "I recommend you speak with your attorney privately before you respond." Edward said quietly to his sister Lillian. She looked at him. He said, "Sit down." She sat. The room was very quiet. Rosemary had not spoken. She had sat through all of it, the documents placed on the table, the DNA report, Lillian's response with the specific contained attention of a woman who had spent 35 years in rooms where difficult things were happening and had learned to be present without being consumed. Now she spoke. She said to Lillian directly, "I didn't come here for the money." She said, "I came because a woman named Marigold Owens spent her life being erased, and the least I can do is be here when the erasing stops." She said, "Whatever you decide, I'm not going away. I've been here all along. You just didn't know it." The chandelier above the table was the one that had hung in this room for as long as the house had stood. It cast the same light on everyone. The negotiation lasted 4 hours. Giles Lillian's attorney was competent. Aggie had expected this and had said so to Malcolm in their preparation, and Malcolm had agreed the Thornwood family did not retain incompetent lawyers. Giles would find every available argument and make it as well as it could be made, and they would need to be ready for each one. They were ready. The first argument was authentication. Giles requested independent verification of all three documents: the birth certificate, the diary, and the agreement. Malcolm had anticipated this and produced the chain of custody documentation for each: the county archive, confirmation for the birth certificate, the forensic analysis for the diary, the signature comparison report for the agreement. The second argument was the DNA analysis. Giles challenged the methodology, the sample collection, the laboratory's accreditation. Malcolm produced the laboratory certifications and the collection protocols and the affidavit of the technician who had processed the samples. The third argument was the fraudulent concealment doctrine, specifically whether it applied when the concealment had been conducted by a party who was now deceased. Malcolm cited 3 cases in this jurisdiction where the doctrine had been applied to ongoing concealment conducted by estates, not individuals. He cited the continued payments to Marigold from the estate after Harrison II's death as evidence that the concealment had been an estate function, not merely a personal one. Giles took a recess. He came back with a different argument. He said even accepting the claim, the appropriate remedy is a proportional share of the estate as it existed at the time of the original injury, 1961. The estate has grown substantially since then through investments and business activities unrelated to any harm to your client. The claim cannot reach assets that were created independently. Malcolm said, the claim reaches assets that were created using the advantage conferred by the original exclusion. A business empire built on capital that should have been shared cannot retroactively separate the tainted foundation from the structure built on it. We can pursue a full accounting or we can negotiate a reasonable settlement. Those are the options. Giles took another recess. He came back and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I need to speak with my clients privately. Oh! They went to the library. Aggie and Malcolm and Rosemary sat in the dining room and did not speak much. Malcolm made notes. Aggie drank her coffee. Rosemary looked at the chandelier. After 30 minutes, they heard voices from the library, not the words, just the sound of people disagreeing, the specific cadence of a conversation that was not resolving cleanly. After 45 minutes, the library door opened. Edward came out first. He was 51 and had always had the look of a man carrying something heavier than he appeared to be carrying, the specific compression of someone who had organized their life around an identity that required maintenance. He came back to the table and he sat down and he looked at the documents that were still laid out in the center. He said, "What do you want?" He said it to the table. Then he looked up and said it to Aggie. Aggie looked at Rosemary. She said, "That's not my question to answer." Rosemary stood. She stood the way she stood when she was moving through the care center purposefully, without excess, the movement of someone who had somewhere to be and knew how to get there. She walked around the table and stood before Edward and Lillian, who had come to stand in the doorway of the dining room. She said, "I want what's mine. Half the estate calculated on the current value and adjusted for the exclusion period. Malcolm has the methodology." She said, "I want the silence agreement and the full documentation of the concealment placed in the county historical record. Not sealed, public." She said, "I want an acknowledgement that Marigold Owens was the mother of Harrison Thornwood's daughter. Not a press release, a formal statement filed with the estate record. Her name on a document connected to this family, the way it should have been from the beginning." She paused. She said, "And I want an apology for my mother." The room was quiet. Lillian had come fully into the room now. She was standing with the specific rigidity of a person who had built their entire self on a structure and was being asked to watch the structure come down. Her face had the look of controlled anger, not the hot anger of someone reacting, the cold anger of someone who had decided what they felt and was holding it. She said, "I will not apologize to a—" She stopped. She had been going to say a word. She had not said it. The word was there in the silence anyway, in the space she had left for it. "Edward," said Lillian. She said she was a servant. She was paid. The arrangement was, Rosemary said, "The arrangement was that my mother signed away my birthright at 22 years old because she had no other options, and your grandfather had all of them." She said it evenly, not with anger, with the specific flat accuracy of someone stating what the record showed. She said she spent 40 years keeping a promise she made because she was afraid. She died in a care facility where the staff-to-patient ratio was higher than the one where I work, which is already not good enough. She died without anyone sitting with her who knew what she had survived. She said, "I don't want your sympathy. I want the record corrected," Edward said Lillian. He said it quietly with the specific weight of a man who had been putting off a conversation for a long time and understood it could not be put off any further. He said, "It's over." Lillian turned to look at him. He said, "Giles told us. There's no path through this. The criminal referral alone, the agreement is going to the prosecutor regardless of what we do here. The estate council has advised that contesting the DNA evidence will cost more than settling and will not change the outcome." He said, "It's over." She said, "We are Thornwoods." He said, "We are Thornwoods who built on something our grandfather did that was wrong. That's what we are." The room was very still. The chandelier above them was doing what chandeliers did, casting its light evenly without preference on everyone in the room. Lillian stood for a long moment. She stood with the specific quality of a woman who had never bent and was discovering for the first time that bending was required. It was not a comfortable discovery. Her face held the specific expression of someone experiencing something genuine against their will. The emotion not performed, not strategic, but arriving anyway. The way things arrived when the defenses had been exhausted. She lowered herself. Not gracefully, she was not a woman who did graceful things she had not chosen, but completely. She sat on the floor. It was not a theatrical kneel. It was the movement of a woman whose legs had done what they were going to do. She said, "I'm sorry." She said it to the floor. Rosemary looked at her. She looked at Lillian Thornwood Crane sitting on the floor of her family's dining room, saying words she had never said to anyone in her life, saying them to a woman she had not known existed before tonight. Aggie watched Rosemary's face. She watched the 65 years of it, the years of not knowing, the years of building a life from what had been left after everything else had been taken, the years of caring for people without anyone caring in return in the way that was owed. She watched all of that receive what it was receiving. Rosemary did not speak for a long time. Then she turned. She walked toward the door. She said without turning back, "I don't need your apology, Lillian. You said it because you had to." She said, "But my mother waited 40 years for someone in this family to say they were sorry. She never heard it. She died not hearing it." She stopped at the door. She said, "So say it again. Not to me, to her." She left the room. Malcolm gathered his documents. He did not look at Lillian or Edward. Aggie stood. She looked at Edward, who was still seated looking at the table. She said, "Harrison asked me to do what he couldn't. I've done it." She said, "I don't have anything else to say to either of you." She went after Rosemary. 6 months is not a long time. It is long enough, Aggie had found, to understand what has changed and what has not. The trees outside the Thornwood estate had leafed out and begun to turn by the time the settlement was finalized. The same trees she had looked at through the same windows for 15 years, doing what they had always done, indifferent to the proceedings below. She had moved out in March. She had not taken much. The books from her sitting room, the photograph of her and Harrison from the study, the one from the second year of their marriage taken at a restaurant in the city, both of them slightly formal in the way of people who were still learning how to be in photographs together. The small lamp she had bought herself early in the marriage because the lamps that came with the house were too large and too formal, and she had needed something that was hers. She had left the rest. She had not said goodbye to Lillian. She had said goodbye to the house, to the kitchen where she had eaten breakfast for 15 years, to the garden where she had sat in the summers, to the room at the top of the narrow stairs where she had opened a safe and found the specific weight of a family's concealed truth and carried it to where it needed to go. She had said thank you to the room, which was perhaps eccentric, and she had meant it. The new house was small. 3 rooms and a kitchen and a porch in a neighborhood that was neither wealthy nor struggling, the kind of neighborhood that simply existed and got on with it. She had found it through an agent who had shown her 6 properties and had described this one as modest, which she had understood to mean it was not impressive, which was exactly what she needed. It was 2 blocks from Marigold House. This had not been an accident. The settlement had taken 4 months to finalize. There were lawyers and accountants and the specific slow mechanics of transferring half of a substantial estate from people who did not want to give it to someone who had not known she was owed it. Malcolm managed it with the focused persistence of a man who had been waiting 10 years for exactly this kind of work. He did not hurry. He did not accept delays that were tactics. He was, Aggie thought, very good at his job, and she suspected he had always been very good at his job, which was probably why the Thornwoods had dismissed him. Rosemary had been present at every meeting. She had come directly from her shifts at Hillside, sometimes still in her work clothes, and she had sat across from the Thornwood attorneys and their accountants with the specific patience of a woman who had spent 35 years waiting for people who needed things to be ready to receive them. She had asked the right questions. She had understood the documents. She had on 2 occasions corrected errors in the accounting that were not accidents. She was, Aggie had thought, watching her, very good at this. She had not known she was going to need to be. She had learned anyway. Marigold House had opened on the 1st of October. Rosemary had chosen the name without deliberation, had said it to Malcolm when he asked what she wanted to call the development trust, and he had written it down, and it had remained on every document since. Marigold House. The name said aloud at a city planning meeting and a county filing on the construction permits, on the press release that Malcolm's assistant had drafted and that the local paper had run with a photograph of Rosemary and the building site. The name Marigold spoken publicly in connection with the Thornwood inheritance. For the first time in 65 years. The building was 4 stories on a lot that had been a parking structure and had been converted with the specific attention to light and air of an architect who had been given a clear purpose and the means to fulfill it. Affordable units for nurses, home health aides, medical technicians, the people who cared for the city's sick and elderly, and returned each evening to apartments they could barely afford on the wages that caring paid. Rosemary had kept her own apartment. She had stayed at Hillside for 2 more months after the settlement had given proper notice, had trained her. Replacement had said goodbye to the patients who would remember and repeated the goodbye for the ones who would not. She had cried once in the parking lot after her last shift and had been done with it by the time she reached her car. She had moved into Marigold House, Unit 2, B, 2nd floor, east-facing morning light. The ribbon cutting was on a Tuesday. Aggie stood beside Rosemary and Malcolm in front of the building, while a small crowd of residents and the city officials and journalists arranged themselves for photographs. Someone handed Rosemary scissors. She cut the ribbon with the specific clean motion of someone who had been cutting things efficiently for decades and applied the same competence to ceremonial tasks. A journalist asked her afterward about the name. She said, "My mother's name was Marigold. She spent her life being told her name didn't belong anywhere that mattered. This building belongs to the people who do the work that keeps everyone else alive." It seemed right. The journalist wrote something down. He asked, "Do you have any resentment toward the Thornwood family?" Rosemary considered this. She said no. She said, "They gave me something they didn't know they were giving me." He said, "What was that?" She said, 65 years to become who I am without any help from them. 65 years to learn what mattered and what didn't. 65 years of work that I chose that meant something that I was good at. She said, "Money can give you a lot of things. It can't give you that." She said they spent 65 years trying to make sure I didn't exist. What they actually did was make sure I grew up without their influence. Given what their influence produced, I think I got the better end of that. The journalist wrote this down, too. The check arrived at Malcolm's office in November. Anonymous. A donation to the Marigold House Operating Fund sufficient to cover 2 years of reduced-rate units for residents transitioning out of higher-cost care arrangements. Aggie recognized the handwriting on the accompanying note, which said only for the residents. She did not tell Rosemary. She did not need to. She thought about Lillian sitting on the floor of the Thornwood dining room. She thought about what it cost a person to be, Who Lillian was, the specific, exhausting maintenance of an identity built entirely on the idea that you were better than other people, that your blood was worth more, that a servant's child was less. She thought even Lillian. Not forgiveness, exactly. Understanding which was a different thing and perhaps more useful. On a morning in late October, Aggie sat on her porch with coffee, and Rosemary sat in the other chair, and they looked at the street, which was doing what streets did in the morning, the ordinary traffic of people going about their lives. The light coming in at the angle it came in at this time of year, the specific October quality of a day that had decided to be beautiful without making a production of it. Rosemary said, "I've been thinking about what to do with the rest of it." Aggie said, "The money." Rosemary said, "Harrison left enough that I can't spend it on housing and still have reasonable concerns about the remainder." She said, "I've been thinking about nursing education, scholarships for women who come to it late, the ones who are 45 and need retraining and can't afford the gap." She said, "Women who found their way to something that mattered without being handed anything." Aggie said, "That sounds like something Marigold would have wanted." Rosemary said, "I think so." They drank their coffee. The street did what it did. Inside Aggie's house on the wall beside the kitchen door hung two things side by side. One was her wedding photograph, she and Harrison, the restaurant, the slight formality of people still learning each other. The other was Rosemary's birth certificate in a plain frame, the paper oblong and the names clear. Rosemary Owens. Harrison Thornwood II. Marigold Owens. The names that should have been said aloud 65 years ago, said now. Present on a wall in the morning light in a small house 2 blocks from a building named for a woman who had waited 40 years and whose daughter had not waited a day longer than necessary. Aggie finished her coffee. She said, "More." Rosemary held out her cup. The morning continued.